The Duero's share. A vintage murder. A 30-year secret. A debt that can only be paid in blood. 10 years ago, Elias Thorne ran from the shadow of the Finca Santos. Now he is an operative who specializes in making problems disappear. But when Don Alvaro Santos is poisoned in front of him at a riverside dinner, Elias is forced to solve the one puzzle he ran away from, his own past. With his childhood friend framed for the crime, Elias peels back the layers of the valley's history, revealing a suicide pact rooted in a tragic accident from 1994. As he tracks a killer who may not exist, Elias discovers that his father's death was the down payment on the Santos Empire, and his mother has been waiting 3 decades to pay the balance. Chapter 1. The River of Ghosts. The late afternoon light in the Ribeira del Duero didn't just illuminate the valley. It possessed it. It poured over the limestone cliffs and the endless terraced rows of twisted tempranillo vines like melted honey, turning the dust into gold and the shadows into bruises. I sat on the terracotta roof of my mother's farmhouse, replacing a cracked tile. My hands were rough with the dust of the clay, a sensation that felt alien after years of handling sleek Glock 19 and shuffling decks of chemically treated playing cards. From this height I could see the hierarchy of the world. Below me sat our farmhouse, a small, whitewashed square of stone with a sagging porch and a roof that sighed in the wind. It was a humble, stubborn thing, clinging to the edge of the property line. But 300 yards up the hill sat the Finca Santos. It was the heart of the province, a sprawling fortress of golden sandstone and wrought iron, surrounded by the most fertile acres in Spain. It was the finca, the estate. For 5 generations, the Santos bloodline had pumped the lifeblood of the region. They didn't just make wine. They employed the villages. They built the roads. They owned the water rights. To live in San Esteban was to live in the shadow of that house. Don Alvaro Santos was the current king. He had taken a failing rustic vineyard and turned it into a global empire. He was the soil, and we were just the dust that lived on it. I wiped sweat from my forehead. I had escaped this shadow the day I turned 18. I remembered that morning vividly. I was packing a duffel bag, terrified. It was my mother, Isabella, who had handed me the ticket to Madrid. She hadn't cried. She had grabbed my face with her rough worker's hands and looked me in the eye. "You have a mind for the horizon, Elias," she had told me, her eyes fierce. "You see patterns. You see the world differently. Do not let this valley bury you like it buried your father. Do not let it tie you down like it tied me. Go, and do not look back until you are someone else." She had pushed me out of the nest because she knew I was a genius at solving puzzles, and there were no puzzles left here, only gravestones. So I ran. I went to America. I used that pattern recognition mind to become a magician, and then, inevitably, the intelligence community found me. They saw what she saw, a man who could see the trick before it was performed. But now, 10 years later, the valley had pulled me back. "Elias!" My mother's voice drifted up from the patio. I looked down. I was used to seeing Isabella in the grays and blacks of a perpetual widow. But today, the woman standing on the patio looked like a stranger. She was wearing a summer dress of pale yellow linen. It was an old dress, the style from the late 80s, but it fit her perfectly. Her hair, usually pulled back in a severe gray bun, was loose, falling in soft, dark waves around her shoulders. She looked radiant. She looked like the girl who had once dreamed of leaving this place before the debts and the death anchored her here. "Come down," she called, waving a hand. Her laughter drifted up to me, light and airy. "We must go. Alvaro hates to be kept waiting." I slid down the ladder, wiping dust from my jeans. "Mama, you look incredible. What's the occasion?" "It is a beautiful evening, Elias," she said, spinning slightly so the dress flared. "Why should I not dress for it? Tonight feels light. Do you feel it?" She took a deep breath of the hot, herbal air, thyme, rosemary, and dry earth, smiling at the massive villa on the hill. "We are taking the car," she said, walking toward our rusted Fiat. "He has set the table by the water." I froze, my hand on the passenger door. The river? Yes, she said, sliding into the driver's seat, down by the old tractor shed. A cold chill went through me. The Duero River was the artery that connected the villages, but for us it was a scar. That specific spot by the tractor shed was a graveyard. It was where my father, Gabriel, had died 30 years ago. Why would he want to have dinner on a grave? I asked quietly. Isabella didn't flinch. She put the car in gear. Because the past is heavy, Elias. But I think, finally, we are ready to put it down. The drive took 5 minutes, winding through the endless rows of vines. The air smelled of fermenting sugar and money. The scene by the river was surreal. The staff had dragged a long, heavy mahogany table down to the grassy bank, right to the edge of the rushing water. Crystal chandeliers were strung from the branches of the ancient poplar trees, catching the violet and orange hues of the setting sun. It looked like a wedding, but there was an unspoken tension and unease in the area. It felt more like a funeral. Don Alvaro Santos sat at the head of the table. He was 65, but he looked magnificent. He was fit, his shoulders broad under a cream-colored linen suit. His hair was a shock of thick, snow-white waves. He possessed the kind of charisma that only comes from centuries of ownership. He wasn't just a man. He was an institution. I remembered him vividly, despite the years. The young, ambitious man still shone through. The man never crumbled under the weight of the burdens he was carrying. When he saw my mother, the bluster vanished. He stood up, something he rarely did these days, and stared. "The summer of '84, he whispered, his voice carried by the wind. "Hello, Alvaro," Isabella said, stepping out of the car. She stood tall, meeting his gaze with an equality I had never seen before. "Isabella," he breathed, "you look exactly like the day we christened the West Block." The 3 Santos children were seated, but they looked faded next to their father's brilliance. Lucas, the eldest, was sweating through his suit. He had his mother's soft chin and anxious eyes. I vaguely remembered Elena, the gentlewoman who had withered away in the great villa, overwhelmed by the pressure of the legacy and, like Isabella, a foreigner into these lands. She never quite belonged here, but her eyes always lit up when she spoke to her husband. The light in her eyes never dimmed until that day she died in childbirth. Sophia, the winemaker, looked angry, staring at the rushing water. She had Alvaro's fire. She was his splitting image, just more feminine and less striking. Mateo, the youngest, was nursing a whiskey. He looked terrified. He was the child she died to save, a boy who never knew his mother and nor cared for by his father. He was raised instead by the staff of the vineyards. And my mother. "Elias!" Alvaro roared, turning his grin to me. "The prodigal son, look at you. You have Gabriel's shoulders, but I hear you have a mathematician's brain. A magician, is it?" "Something like that, Don Alvaro," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was iron. "Sit," he commanded. "Sit next to your beautiful mother." I took my seat. "I remember when we used to picnic here," Alvaro mused, looking at the water. "Before, everything, the 4 of us, me, Elena, Gabriel, and Isabella. We were young. We thought we could fight the sky." "Mama hated picnics," Sophia muttered. "She was always sick." "She came because she loved us," Alvaro corrected sharply. "And Gabriel, he would fix the engine of the old truck while we ate. He never stopped working. He was the engine of this place." He looked at Lucas with disdain. "Unlike some." "I work, Papa," Lucas snapped. "I run the accounts." "Gabriel ran the soul," Alvaro said. Then he turned to my mother, his face softening. "Isn't that right, Isabella?" "Gabriel did what was necessary," she said, her voice even. "As did we all." Alvaro cleared his throat. "I have invited you all here," Alvaro announced, "because tomorrow the lawyers arrive. I will finalize the will. The papers are drawn up, but they are not signed." "You haven't signed them?" Mateo asked, his voice cracking. "Not yet," Alvaro said. "I wanted one last dinner. One last night as the king, before I decide who is worthy of the crown." He was playing with them. But I looked at my mother. She wasn't tense. She was calmly unfolding her napkin, watching the river flow by with a serene, happy expression. But tonight, Alvaro continued, we do not talk of business. We talk of perfection. He gestured to Sophia. Bring the 1924. A hush fell over the table as she raised the dusty bottle. The wax seal was black, cracked with a century of waiting. My father bottled this, Alvaro said, in a year of great hardship. He told me it should only be opened for a moment of absolute clarity. The cork was pulled. It crumbled slightly, but the wine flowed, dark, inky, almost like blood. Sophia poured a little in the glass, swirled it, and inhaled. The look of delight crossed her face as she went over to pour a glass for him. Only for me, he said, and for Isabella. Sophia's eyebrow raised, but she poured one for Alvaro without question, before moving to pour one for my mother. Isabella placed her hand over her glass. She smiled at Alvaro, a genuine, warm smile. No, Alvaro, she said softly, not for me. I am light enough tonight. Alvaro paused. He looked at her yellow dress. He looked at her face, the merry lights in his eyes dimmed a little. As you wish, my dear. He turned back to his children. He lifted his crystal glass. The aroma drifted across the table. Blackberries, leather, and something else, sweet and sharp, like crushed almonds. To the memory of friends lost, Alvaro said, raising the glass toward the overgrown patch of grass where my father had died. To Gabriel, and to Elena, the silent partners. He drank. He set the glass down. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back, letting the summer breeze ruffle his white hair. A smile touched his lips, the smile of a man who believes he has finally balanced the books. Exquisite, he whispered. Then the smile vanished. His body went rigid. His eyes snapped open, wide and full of terrified realization. The charisma vanished, replaced by animal panic. He gasped, his hands clawing at his throat, dragging the silver cutlery down with a crash. Papa, Sophia screamed, tipping over the expensive wine that was worth more than a Porsche. Alvaro convulsed once, violently, pink foam bubbling at his lips. He slumped forward, his face hitting the fine china with a sickening crunch. Dead. The silence that followed lasted only a second, shattered by the rushing river. Then chaos. I smelled the bitter almonds. Cyanide. Nobody moves, I commanded, my voice cutting through the panic. I looked down at my mother. Isabella hadn't moved. She hadn't screamed. She sat perfectly still in her yellow dress, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't looking at the body with horror. She was looking at it with a strange, peaceful acceptance. He's gone, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the water. Yes, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. And someone at this table killed him. Chapter 2. The Red Stain. The golden light of the evening didn't fade. It was strangled. In the space of 20 minutes, the serene pastoral silence of the Ribera del Duero was shattered by the harsh, rhythmic wail of sirens. Blue flashing lights cut through the vineyard, bouncing off the limestone cliffs and turning the muddy river water into a strobe of harsh, artificial color. The crickets stopped chirping, terrified into silence by the mechanical intrusion. I stood by the mahogany table, my back to the rushing river. The magician part of my brain, the part that counted cards and tracked sight lines, was already cataloging the scene. Don Alvaro was still slumped over the table, his white hair matted with the foam that had bubbled from his lips. The spilled wine had soaked into the white linen tablecloth, spreading outward like a gunshot wound, dripping slowly onto the grass. I had moved my mother away from the body, seating her on a stone bench under the shadow of a poplar tree. She was still sitting there, hands folded in the lap of her yellow dress, watching the chaos with that same unsettling, serene expression. She looked like a statue placed in a garden, untouched by the storm raging around her. Back away, a voice barked, rough as gravel, a voice I am very familiar with, Inspector Rafa Morales. We had grown up in the same dusty classroom in San Esteban. He was the son of the butcher, and I was the son of the mechanic. We used to smoke stolen cigarettes behind the church. But while I had left to chase the horizon, Rafa had stayed. The valley had hardened him. He was stocky, cynical, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled out of granite with a dull knife. He hated the heat. He hated the Santos family for owning everything he walked on, and based on the way he glared at me, he hated me for leaving. "Elias Thorne," Morales said, stopping at the edge of the grass. He lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating the deep, dark bags under his eyes. "I heard the prodigal son had returned. I didn't think you'd bring bodies with you." "I didn't bring this one, Rafa," I said, keeping my voice level. "It looks like cyanide. Bitter almonds. Fast-acting. He was dead before he hit the table." Morales raised an eyebrow, exhaling a plume of smoke that mixed with the river mist. "Cyanide? You're a toxicologist now? I thought you moved boxes for a shipping company in Nevada." "I read a lot," I lied, "and I know what almonds smell like." Morales walked past me, stepping onto the pristine grass with muddy boots. He did it deliberately, a small act of class warfare. He looked at the body of the king of the valley. He looked at the spilled wine. Then he looked at the 3 Santos children. They were a tableau of disintegration. Lucas was pacing a tight circle, his expensive Italian loafers slipping on the wet grass. He was talking rapidly into his phone, his voice a high-pitched whisper. "Yes, dead. No, the deal is just hold on. I can fix this. Do not pull the funding." Mateo was on his knees near the bushes, retching. The whiskey he had nursed all evening was coming back up. He looked like a child, terrified and useless. And Sophia stood by the table, staring at her father's hands. She looked frozen, trapped in the amber of the moment before the scream. "Who poured the wine?" Morales asked, addressing the group. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Lucas's babbling. The silence that followed was heavy, weighted with 30 years of family resentment. Lucas stopped pacing. He slowly lowered his phone. He looked at the dead body of his father, and then he looked at his sister. I saw the calculation in his eyes, the instant reptile brain survival instinct. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "She did," Lucas said. "Sophia opened the bottle. She poured the glass." Sophia looked up, her eyes blazing with sudden, fierce clarity. "I poured it because he asked me to. You watched me. You were sitting right there, Lucas." "You were fighting," Lucas accused, his voice rising in pitch, performing for the police. "You were angry about the will. You thought he was going to cut you out. You thought he was going to give the land to the trust." "That's a lie," Sophia shouted, stepping toward him, her hands balled into fists. "I loved him. He was difficult, but I loved him." "Enough," Morales snapped. He didn't look at Lucas. He kept his eyes on Sophia. In his mind, the narrative was already written. The angry daughter. The inheritance. The opportunity. It was the oldest story in the world. He gestured to a forensics technician who had just arrived with a field kit, a young woman named Elena who looked far too green for this. "Test the glass," Morales ordered, "and test the dregs on the table. Rafa, wait. Secure the bottle. If the wine is poisoned—" "I know how to do my job, Elias," Morales interrupted, blowing smoke in my direction. "Step back. You're a witness, not a detective, and definitely not a friend." I stepped back, clenching my jaw. I watched the technician swab the rim of the crystal goblet. I watched her dip a chemical test strip into the puddle of dark red wine near Alvaro's head. The seconds stretched out. The river rushed by, oblivious to the tragedy on its banks. The generator hummed. The technician looked at the strip. She looked up, her eyes wide. "It turned blue, Inspector," she said, her voice trembling. "Positive, high concentration. It's cyanide." Morales nodded as if he expected nothing else. He dropped his cigarette and crushed it into the grass with his heel. "Sophia Santos," he said, walking toward her. "Turn around. Put your hands behind your back." "What?" Sophia gasped, backing away until she hit the edge of the heavy table. The chandelier light caught the tears on her cheeks. "No. Rafa, please, we grew up together. You know me. I'm innocent." "You killed your father," Morales said coldly. "You poured the drink. You handed it to him. It's poison. That's murder." He grabbed her wrist. She struggled, panic finally breaking through her shock. "I didn't," she screamed, looking at me. "Elias, tell him. I didn't put anything in it." "Rafa, stop," I said, moving between them. I put a hand on Morales's chest. "It was a mistake. Two uniformed officers instantly had their hands on their batons. Morales looked at my hand, then up at my face. His eyes were hard, flinty. "Touch me again, Elias, and you'll spend the night in a cell next to her. You have no authority here. You're just a magician who ran away." "Use your brain, Rafa," I said, dropping my hand but holding his gaze. "Think for a second. She opened a vintage bottle in front of 5 witnesses. She pulled the cork. She poured it. When did she slip the cyanide in? Sleight of hand? In front of you? In front of me?" I pointed at Lucas. "Or him. He has more to gain than she does." "She's a winemaker," Morales countered. "She knows chemistry. She knows additives. Maybe she drugged the glass beforehand." "Then test the bottle," I demanded. "If she poisoned the wine, then the poison is in the bottle. If the poison is in the bottle, she would have had to inject it through the cork, or recork it perfectly. That takes time. That takes planning. It proves it wasn't a crime of passion." Morales paused. He looked at the dusty bottle of 1924 sitting in the center of the table. It looked innocent, a piece of history in dark glass. "Fine," Morales grunted. He motioned to the technician. "Test the bottle. Shut him up." Sophia stopped struggling. Lucas stopped talking. Even my mother, sitting under the tree, seemed to lean forward slightly, her silhouette sharp against the shadows. The technician picked up the heavy bottle. She took a long pipette and drew a sample of the dark liquid from deep inside the neck, past where the cork had rested. She dropped the liquid onto a fresh test strip. We waited. I watched the paper. White. It stayed white. The technician frowned. She shook the strip. She did it again. She swirled the bottle gently, taking a sample from the bottom. "White." "Negative," the technician said, sounding confused. "Inspector, the wine in the bottle is clean." A murmur went through the group. "Impossible," Lucas whispered, his face pale. "He drank from that bottle. I watched him." "See?" Sophia cried, hope flooding her face, making her look young again. "I didn't poison the wine. It's clean." Morales stared at the bottle, then at the glass. He didn't look happy. He looked annoyed. The simple narrative, angry daughter poisons dad, had just developed a hole the size of the Duero. But Morales was a simple man. He liked straight lines. He didn't like magic tricks. "It doesn't clear you, Sophia," Morales said, his voice hard. "It condemns you." "What?" I asked. "The bottle is clean, Rafa." "Exactly," Morales said, gesturing to the table. "The bottle is clean. The glass is dirty. That means the poison wasn't in the vintage. It was added during the pour." He mimed a sleight of hand motion, mocking my profession. "A pinch of powder in the glass, a drop from a ring. Whatever. You were the only one close enough to do it, Sophia. You handed him death in a clean cup." "It's the only explanation." He spun her around and slapped the cuffs on her wrists. The metal clicked shut, a harsh final sound in the night air. "No," Sophia screamed. "I swear, Elias." "Take her," Morales ordered the officers. They dragged her up the muddy bank toward the flashing lights of the patrol cars. She was crying now, shouting her innocence, her heels dragging in the mud, ruining her silk shoes. Lucas didn't move to help her. He watched her go, a strange expression on his face. Relief. He was calculating the shares. With Alvaro dead and Sophia arrested, he was the sole acting heir. Mateo was sobbing into his hands, useless and broken. I stood there, helpless. I couldn't fight the Guardia Civil. Not here. Not as Elias. I turned to look at the table. The clean bottle, the poisoned glass. It was a classic, impossible crime. A locked room mystery, but the room was a wine bottle. If the bottle was clean, Morales was right. The poison had to be introduced at the glass. But I had watched Sophia. I had watched her hands. She hadn't palmed anything. She hadn't slipped anything. This was a magic trick. A force. The killer had manipulated the variables so that only one outcome was possible, while making it look like chance. But Sophia wasn't a magician. She was blunt, emotional, and loud. She didn't have the finesse for this. I looked at Morales, who was bagging the evidence. He was handling the glass with care, but he was ignoring the cork. It lay on the table, forgotten. To him, it was trash. The bottle was clean, so the cork was irrelevant. "I'm going to prove she didn't do it, Rafa," I called out. Morales stopped. He looked back at me, his face illuminated by the lighter as he lit another cigarette. "Go back to your shipping crates, Elias," he warned. "This isn't a game, and this valley isn't your playground anymore. You left. You don't get to come back and play hero." He walked away, following the patrol car that held Sophia. I stood by the river, listening to the water rush over the spot where my father died. The air smelled of jasmine, river mud, and the metallic tang of blood. The bottle was clean. The glass was dirty. How? I walked to the table. I looked around to ensure the forensic tech wasn't watching. She was busy packing her kit. I reached out and picked up the cork. I rolled it in my fingers. It felt dry, old. The bottom was stained purple-black. I slipped it into my pocket. "Elias!" I turned. My mother was standing behind me. The blue lights of the police cars washed over her yellow dress, turning it a sickly, bruised green. The serene smile was gone, replaced by a look of profound exhaustion, as if the energy that had sustained her through dinner had finally evaporated. "It is time to go home," she said. Chapter 3. The Magician's Choice. The farmhouse was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a heavy rhythmic sound like a heartbeat slowing down. Outside, the distant rhythmic chirping of cicadas had finally resumed, the blue lights of the police having faded into the night. I had walked Mother home instead of driving, a breath of fresh air to calm her nerves. She had moved like a sleepwalker, her hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. When we reached the door, she had gone straight to her room, closing it with a soft click. No tears, no hysterics, just that terrifying, unnatural calm she had worn since the moment Alvaro fell. I sat at the kitchen table, a single beeswax candle burning. In front of me lay the cork. I rolled it between my fingers. To the untrained eye, it was garbage, a piece of bark that had held its breath for 100 years. But to me, it was a prop. I pulled a jeweler's loupe from my pocket, part of the kit I always traveled with. I held the cork under the candlelight. The bottom was stained a deep, inky purple, almost black. That was normal for a wine this old. But the texture, I focused on the wax seal residue on the top. It was black, brittle. But right in the center, invisible to the naked eye, there was a tiny irregularity. A pinprick, or just a bubble in the wax from 1924. The bottle was clean. The glass was dirty. Morales believed in simple mechanics. Sophia added poison to the glass. But I knew Sophia. I remembered her hands when we were children, teaching her to prune the vines. She was strong, capable, but she lacked finesse. When she was emotional, she was clumsy. If she had tried to palm a capsule of cyanide in front of her father, Lucas, Mateo, me, and 5 staff members, someone would have seen it. This was a magic trick, a magician's choice. You offer the audience 3 cards, but you manipulate them so they only pick the one you want. Alvaro didn't just happen to die. He was steered into death. I pocketed the cork. I couldn't sit here. I blew out the candle and slipped out the back door. Finca Santos loomed on the hill, a black silhouette against the stars. Built in the 19th century, renovated in the 90s, it was a fortress of limestone and wrought iron. I skirted the edge of the vineyard, moving through the shadows. The police tape fluttered down by the river, a yellow scar in the distance. I reached the side gate of the villa. It was locked, of course, but I knew the code, 1985. The year Lucas and I were born. We had been inseparable once, 2 boys born a month apart, on opposite sides of the property line. We had learned to ride bikes together, learned to swim in the river together. But as we grew older, the fence became taller. He went to boarding school in Switzerland. I went to the local technical college. I punched in the code. Click. The gate swung open. He hadn't changed it. I crossed the courtyard, my boots silent on the cobblestones. The house was dark except for a single warm light burning in the study on the ground floor. I approached the French doors. They were unlocked. Security in the valley was a joke. Everyone knew everyone, and the Santos name was usually protection enough. I stepped inside. The study smelled of old leather, unsmoked Cuban cigars, and panic. It was a room designed to intimidate. The walls were lined with first editions. A massive globe stood in the corner. And dominating the room was the desk, a slab of mahogany that looked like an altar. Lucas Santos was standing behind it. He wasn't grieving. He was frantically shoving papers into a shredder. Whir, crunch, whir. "A little late for spring cleaning, Lucas," I said, leaning against the doorframe. Lucas jumped, nearly dropping a stack of documents. He spun around, eyes wide, sweat glistening on his forehead. "Elias! Jesus!" He clutched his chest, his face pale. "You can't just walk in here. This is a crime scene." "The river is a crime scene," I said, walking into the room. "This is just an office. What are you shredding, Lucas? Love letters? Tax returns?" "Business," Lucas snapped, shoving the rest of the pile into the machine. The teeth of the shredder chewed through the thick bond paper. "Dad left a mess. I'm trying to protect the estate." "Protect it? Or liquidate it?" I walked over to the sidebar and poured myself a glass of water. I watched him over the rim. He was vibrating with anxiety. His tie was undone, his expensive linen suit rumpled. He looked like a man who was drowning on dry land. "They took Sophia," Lucas said, his voice trembling. "Can you believe it? My own sister." "You pointed the finger at her, Lucas. You practically put the cuffs on her yourself." "I told the truth." Lucas slammed his hand on the desk. "She poured the wine. She hated him, Elias. You know she did. She blamed him for holding her back, for not letting her be the head vintner." She snapped. "Maybe," I said calmly, setting the glass down. "But cyanide isn't a weapon for snapping. A knife is for snapping. A heavy object is for snapping. Cyanide is calculated. It's cold. It takes planning." I looked around the room. My eyes landed on a large framed photograph hanging above the fireplace. I walked over to it. It was black and white, taken in the early 80s. The four of them stood in front of the very first tractor shed, the one that had collapsed on my father. Alvaro stood in the center, looking like a young god, his shirt unbuttoned, laughing. Gabriel, my father, stood next to him, wiping grease from his hands, his smile shy and gentle. Elena, Lucas's mother, sat on a folding chair. She looked frail even then, her hands resting protectively over her stomach, pregnant with Mateo. She wasn't looking at the camera, she was looking at the ground, as if she didn't belong in the frame. And Isabella, my mother. She stood slightly apart, her hair wild in the wind, but it was the eyes that told the story. In the photo, Gabriel wasn't looking at the lens. He was looking at Isabella. And Isabella wasn't looking at him. She was looking into Alvaro's eyes. Only Elena was focused on the lens. "They were complicated people," Lucas said, his voice softening as he saw what I was looking at. "The quartet. That's what the village called them." "Your father looks at my mother like he owns her," I observed. "He looked at everything like he owned it," Lucas muttered. "Papa used people, Elias. He used Mama's inheritance to buy the new vines. He used Gabriel's sweat to plant them. And when they were used up, he moved on. And now he's used up," I said. Lucas laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "And I'm left with the bill." "The Chinese investors," I guessed. He looked up, surprised. "How did you—" "I read the financial news," I lied. "The conglomerate in Shanghai, the resort deal. They want to turn the West Block into a luxury spa." "It wasn't just a deal," Lucas confessed, his voice hollow. He slumped into his father's leather chair. He looked small in it. "I took a bridge loan, a massive one, against my future inheritance. I used the money to cover other losses, futures trading, crypto. It went bad, Elias. It went so bad." "So you needed the estate," I said. "Tonight." "I needed the title," he whispered. "If Papa signed the estate over to a trust for Sophia, or if he split it 3 ways, the bank would call the loan. I'd be in prison for fraud by Monday." "So he dies," I said, "and probate freezes the assets. The bank can't seize what you don't legally own yet. It buys you time." Lucas stared at me. "I didn't kill him, Elias. I swear. Yes, his death helps me. It saves my life, actually. But I didn't do it. I studied him, The sweat, the panic, the shredding. It fit the profile of a desperate man. But Lucas was a coward. He was the kind of man who hired people to do his dirty work. Poison required a steady hand. "I need to use the bathroom," I said abruptly. "What?" "The bathroom, unless you want me to use the antique vase." Lucas waved a hand vaguely toward the in-suite door. "Go ahead." I slipped into the bathroom and locked the door. It was opulent, marble floors, gold fixtures. I didn't use the toilet. I opened the medicine cabinet. Standard toiletries. Cologne, Tom Ford, heavy and expensive. Razor, aspirin. I checked the drawers. Nothing. Then I looked at the trash can. It had been emptied recently, the liner fresh. I knelt down and checked under the sink. There, pushed to the back behind a stack of plush towels, was a small, hard-shell case. Black nylon. I unzipped it. Inside was a medical kit. I recognized it immediately. Lucas had been deathly allergic to wasps since we were kids. I remembered a summer day when we were 10, swimming in the river. He got stung. His face swelled up like a balloon. My mother had saved him with an antihistamine shot before the ambulance arrived. Inside the kit was an auto-injector pen for epinephrine, and next to it, a small box of spare hypodermic needles. The box was open. 2 needles were missing. I stared at them. Needles were useful for allergies, but a fine-gauge needle was also the only way to inject liquid through a cork without leaving a visible hole in the wax. I zipped the case shut and put it back exactly where I found it. I had a motive, bankruptcy and fraud. I had a method, hypodermic needles hidden in his bathroom. I had an opportunity. He lived in the house. He had access to the cellar. It was almost too perfect. I flushed the toilet for effect and walked back into the study. Lucas was on his phone again, whispering furiously in English. "No, the deal is dead. The old man is dead. You have to give me an extension." He saw me and hung up. "Everything okay?" he asked, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Fine," I said. "I'm going home, Lucas. Try to get some sleep. You look like you're about to have a heart attack." I walked out into the cool night air. I had found the needles. I had found the motive. But one thing nagged at me as I walked back through the dark vineyard. If Lucas had injected the poison into the cork, how did he know his father would open that specific bottle tonight? Alvaro had called for the 1924. It was his choice. Wait for the 1924. Unless the magician's choice wasn't about the bottle. I stopped in the middle of a row of vines. The smell of the river mud was strong here. Alvaro had asked for the 1924, but he didn't go to the cellar to get it. The butler did. And before the butler brought it, where had it been? I looked up at the moon. The pieces were moving. I needed to find Mateo, and I needed to find out what happened to the bottle before it reached the river. Because if Lucas was the killer, he had taken a massive gamble that his father would drink the specific vintage he had poisoned. And gamblers like Lucas usually lost. Chapter 4. Blood and Soil. The village of San Esteban was only 5 miles downriver from the golden gates of the Finca Santos, but it felt like a different planet. If the villa was the heart of the region, pumping money and prestige, San Esteban was the liver. It was where the toxins ended up. It was a grid of gray concrete apartment blocks built in the 70s, populated by the seasonal workers who pruned the vines in winter and picked the grapes in autumn. The air didn't smell of lavender and oak here. It smelled of diesel, fried garlic, and stale tobacco. I parked my mother's Fiat 3 streets away from the main plaza, tucking it behind a dumpster. I didn't want the license plate spotted. I stripped off my jacket and rolled up the sleeves of my white dress shirt. I rubbed a little dirt from the wheel arch onto my collar. The magician from Vegas didn't belong here. But Elias, the mechanic's son who used to get into fist fights behind the high school, he fit right in. I was looking for Mateo. Lucas had told me his brother frequented El Matador, a dive bar that sat on the edge of the industrial park. It was the kind of place that didn't have a sign, just a neon outline of a bull that flickered erratically, casting the sidewalk in a sickly red glow. I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The air inside was thick enough to chew. Smoke hung in a blue haze near the ceiling tiles. A soccer match was playing silently on a television mounted in the corner. Real Madrid versus Barcelona, but no one was watching. The clientele were old men drinking orujo and younger men looking for trouble. I found him in the back booth. Mateo Santos looked like a ghost haunting his own life. He was still wearing his suit from dinner, but the tie was gone, and his shirt was stained with what looked like vomit and whiskey. He was 25 years old, handsome in the way his father was, but soft. He lacked the steel that stiffened Alvaro's spine. He wasn't alone. Two men were sitting across from him. They were local muscle, thick-necked, wearing cheap leather jackets despite the sweltering heat. I recognized the type. They weren't cartel. They were bottom feeders, loan sharks who preyed on the gambling addicts of the valley. I walked to the bar. "Brandy," I told the bartender, a man with a face like a dried walnut. "Leave the bottle." He slid a bottle of Veterano and a dirty glass toward me. I poured a shot, downed it to burn the taste of the river out of my mouth, and picked up the bottle. I walked toward the booth. "Papa died tonight. The inheritance. It will be millions." "Inheritance takes months," the one said. "We don't have months. We have a payment schedule." He stabbed the knife into the table, the blade quivering inches from Mateo's hand. I set the brandy bottle down on the table with a loud, heavy thud. The three men jumped. "Gentlemen," I said, flashing a tired, reckless smile, "I think my friend has had enough to drink, and I think you've had enough of his time." The man with the scar looked me up and down. He saw the dust on my shirt. He saw the lean build. He didn't see the threat. He saw a nuisance. "Walk away, farm boy," he growled. "This is family business." "Funny," I said. "I was about to say the same thing. I'm family." I grabbed Mateo's arm. "Up, Mateo. We're leaving." Mateo looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Elias? Don't. They'll kill you." "They're not going to kill anyone," I said calmly. The man with the scar stood up. He was big, 6'3", maybe 250 pounds. He blocked the aisle, casting a shadow over the table. "He owes 40,000 euro, the giant said. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket. Click. The blade caught the neon light. "You paying?" I looked at the knife. Then I looked at the brandy bottle in my hand. I sighed. I really didn't want to do this tonight. It's been a long day. The giant lunged. It was sloppy, telegraphed, a barroom haymaker meant to intimidate, not kill. He led with his shoulder, leaving his center of gravity exposed. I sidestepped the knife, catching his wrist with my left hand. I didn't just hold it. I twisted it outward, applying torque to the joint against the natural rotation. Snap. The sound of the radius bone breaking was loud enough to silence the bar. The giant screamed. Before the sound could fully leave his throat, I drove the heel of my palm upward, striking him directly under the chin. His head snapped back, his teeth clacking together with a sound like a gunshot. He collapsed backward onto the table, overturning a pitcher of sangria and crushing the orange peel. I swung the heavy glass brandy bottle. I didn't break it. I used it as a bludgeon, a tight, backhanded arc that connected with his temple. Crack! He dropped like a sack of wet cement. The bar was silent. The only sound was the soccer match on the TV and the groans of the giant on the floor. The bartender turned up the volume on the television. He wiped a glass. He knew the drill. "In San Esteban, you didn't see anything if you wanted to stay open." I grabbed Mateo by the collar of his ruined suit and hauled him out of the booth. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. "Move," I hissed. We walked out the back door into the alleyway. The air here was cooler, smelling of rain and garbage. I shoved Mateo against the brick wall. He slid down until he was sitting in the dirt, sobbing. "You killed them," he wept. "Oh God, Elias, you killed them." "They're sleeping," I said, crouching down in front of him. "They'll wake up with concussions and a fear of brandy bottles. But right now I don't care about them. I care about the wine." "The wine?" Mateo wiped his nose on his sleeve, looking at me as if I were insane. "Papa is dead. Sophia is in jail. I almost died. And you're talking about wine?" "I'm talking about the 1924, I said. "I know about the debts, Mateo. 40,000 euro? That's a lot of poker games. It was crypto, he sniffled. I thought I could double it. I wanted to show Papa I was smart, that I wasn't just the baby. Did you kill him? I asked, grabbing his chin and forcing him to look at me. Did you poison the bottle so you could get your payout faster? No, Mateo screamed, his eyes full of genuine horror. I loved him. I'm a screw-up, Elias, but I'm not a murderer. I couldn't even watch him die. Then explain the bottle, I demanded. What bottle? The 1924, I bluffed, channeling the confidence of the magician. I checked the cellar logs. Lucas told me there was a discrepancy in the inventory 2 weeks ago. A bottle went missing. Then it reappeared. Mateo's eyes widened. The bluff landed. I borrowed it, he whispered. You stole it. I needed the money, Mateo cried, his voice cracking. Those guys inside, they threatened to break my legs. They threatened to burn down my apartment. I took the bottle from the sanctuary 2 weeks ago. I have a buyer in Madrid, a collector who asks no questions. He offered me 50,000 for it. So you took it, I said. The chain of custody was broken. The bottle left the cellar. Yes, Mateo admitted. I put it in my trunk. I drove to Madrid. I met the guy at a hotel. And he looked at it, Mateo said, looking down at his hands. He used a flashlight. He checked the provenance. He said the cork looked dry. He said the fill level was suspicious. He lowballed me, offered me 5 grand. Mateo put his head in his knees. I couldn't sell the family legacy for 5 grand. I felt sick. I looked at that bottle and I remembered Papa telling us stories about grandfather bottling it. I couldn't do it, so I brought it back. You put it back in the cellar? Yes, last Tuesday when nobody was looking. I sat back on my heels. The timeline fit. The bottle had been out of the secure cellar for at least 24 hours. Did you open it? I asked. No, the seal was intact. Did you drop it? Mateo hesitated. Mateo, I warned. I bumped it, he whispered shamefully. Against the door frame of the car when I was putting it back. A piece of the wax chipped off. Just a small piece on the rim. My pulse quickened. What did you do? I fixed it, he said. I took a lighter. I melted the surrounding wax to cover the chip. I smoothed it over with my thumb. It looked perfect. Nobody noticed. I stood up, staring at the humming sodium light above the alley. He melted the wax. That was it. That was the window. If Mateo had melted the wax to hide a chip, he had inadvertently masked any other tampering. Or he had created the perfect opportunity for someone else. Who knew? I asked. Who knew you took the bottle? Nobody, Mateo said. I was careful. Lucas knew, I guessed. He watches the inventory like a hawk. He tracks every bottle. Mateo shrugged helplessly. Maybe. Lucas knows everything. He has cameras in the hallway. I pulled Mateo to his feet. I dusted off his jacket, though it was a lost cause. Go home, Mateo, I said. Lock your door. Don't talk to the police. Don't talk to Lucas. Where are you going? He asked, swaying slightly. Back to the bar? No, I said. I'm going to the cellar. I need to see where you put that bottle back. Mateo grabbed my sleeve. Elias, thank you. For back there. You moved like you weren't you. I'm just a magician, Mateo, I said softly. It's all smoke and mirrors. Go home, Mateo, I repeated. I watched him stumble down the alley toward his car. I walked back to the Fiat. Mateo had stolen the bottle. He had damaged the wax. He had repaired it with heat. This meant the wax seal, the guarantee of purity, was compromised before tonight. If Lucas saw this on the security cameras, if he saw Mateo tampering with the bottle, he would have known. He would have known that the wax was soft, or at least that it had been messed with. He would have known that a needle hole could be hidden in the repair job. It was brilliant. He could frame his brother for the theft, and his sister for the pour. I drove back toward the estate, the silhouette of the villa rising against the stars. Chapter 5. The Cellar. The San Esteban police station was a squat, brutalist box of concrete that looked like a bunker designed to survive a nuclear war, or at least a riot of drunken grape pickers. It sat on the edge of town, smelling of industrial floor cleaner, stale coffee, and the unique sour sweat of men in handcuffs. It was 2 a.m. The only person awake at the front desk was Sergeant Ruiz, a kid I remembered from high school who used to cheat off my math tests. He was dozing over a muted TikTok feed. I didn't ask for permission. I walked past the desk, moving with the quiet confidence that usually makes people assume you belong there. Ruiz looked up, blinked, and by the time he registered who I was already down the hallway. "Hey, Elias, you can't go back there." "Inspector Morales sent me," I lied over my shoulder, not breaking stride. "He needs Sophia's statement on the timeline." Ruiz hesitated. In that hesitation, I turned the corner to the holding cells. Sophia was in cell 2. She wasn't sleeping. She was sitting on the thin, plastic-wrapped mattress, knees pulled to her chest. She was still wearing her stained winemaking overalls, though they had taken her belt and her shoelaces. Without the armor of her profession, stripped of the boots and the shears, she looked small. She looked like the little girl who used to chase me through the irrigation ditches. "They think I'm a monster," she said, without looking up. Her voice was a dry rasp. "They think you're a convenient solution to a complicated math problem," I said, leaning against the cold steel bars. She looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, swollen from crying, but the fire I knew was still smoldering underneath. "I didn't do it, Elias. I hated him sometimes. God, I hated him. He was a tyrant. He treated us like vines, pruning us back whenever we tried to grow in a direction he didn't like. But he was my father." "I know," I said softly. "I spoke to Mateo." Sophia let out a bitter, jagged laugh. "Mateo, is he sober yet, or is he still crying about his crypto losses?" "He told me about the bottle," I said, watching her face closely. "He told me he stole it, took it to Madrid, brought it back." Sophia's eyes went wide. She stood up, walking to the bars, gripping them until her knuckles turned white. He took the 24 out of the sanctuary. That idiot. The temperature fluctuation alone could have ruined it. That wine is alive, Elias." "He said he chipped the wax," I continued, "and he melted it back together with a lighter to hide the damage." Sophia closed her eyes, exhaling a long breath. "That explains it." "Explains what?" "The pull," she whispered, opening her eyes. "When I opened the bottle at dinner, the cork came out too easily. 100-year-old cork should be fused to the glass. It should be brittle. I used the Asso opener, the 2 prongs, because I was terrified of crumbling it. But even then, it felt loose, gummy, like the wax hadn't set properly for a century. Heat, I noted. Mateo melted it, but he only melted the rim. If the cork felt loose... "Someone else touched it," Sophia finished. "Someone realized the seal was compromised and used it." "Sophia, listen to me," I said, lowering my voice. "This is important. The police test showed the poison wasn't in the wine. It was in the glass, but if the cork was tampered with..." "They painted the bottom," she realized, horror dawning on her face. "Someone injected the poison into the sponge of the cork, or painted the underside. When I pulled it, the vacuum sucked the liquid out," I said. "Or the condensation on the cork dripped into the first pour. You wiped the rim, didn't you?" "Yes," she said, trembling, "with the napkin. It felt oily. I thought it was just seepage. Old vintages weep sometimes." "You wiped the poison onto the glass," I said grimly, "and then you poured the wine over it. You were the mechanism, Sophia, not the killer." She stared at her hands, her winemaker's hands, stained with grape juice and soil, as if they were traitors. "I served it to him. I wiped the rim and I handed him death." "Sit tight," I said, reaching through the bars to squeeze her shoulder. "Don't say anything to Morales about the wax or the napkin. Not yet. If you admit the wax was tampered with, he'll just say you did it." "Where are you going?" "To the sanctuary," I said. "I need to see where that bottle lived, and I need to find what the killer left behind." Getting back into Finca Santos was harder this time. The police had left a patrol car at the main gate, its lights flashing silently against the stone archway. I parked a mile down the road and hiked through the vines. The night was alive with the sound of insects and the distant rush of the river. I circled around to the back of the winery, where the limestone cliffs met the industrial buildings. There was an old ventilation shaft there, hidden behind a thicket of rosemary bushes. Sophia and I had used it as teenagers to sneak into the barrel rooms to steal sips of the reserves. I pulled the grate loose. The hinges were rusted but yielded to leverage. I dropped into the darkness. The air inside the winery hit me like a physical weight. It was cool, humid, and heavy with the smell of oak, vanilla, and the boozy sweet rot of crushed fruit. It was a smell I associated with my childhood. My father, Gabriel, used to bring me here when he worked on the cooling systems. I remembered sitting on a barrel, swinging my legs, watching him fix a compressor with the surgical precision of a master mechanic. "The wine breathes, Elias," he used to tell me. "It sleeps in the winter and wakes in the spring. You have to treat the machines gently, or you wake the baby." I clicked on my penlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of French oak barrels stacked ceiling high. They looked like sleeping beasts. I moved silently through the fermentation hall, past the towering stainless steel tanks that shone like missiles in the moonlight, filtering through the skylights. My footsteps echoed faintly on the concrete. I reached the heavy iron door of the sanctuary, the private cellar carved directly into the bedrock where the Santos family kept their legend collection. The keypad was modern, biometric, but there was a manual override keyhole for emergencies. I pulled out my lockpick set, a souvenir from a job in Berlin, and went to work. The lock was high security but unmaintained. The pins clicked into place. Clunk. The door swung open. The sanctuary was a small circular room, cool and silent. The walls were rough-hewn limestone. In the center stood a tasting table made from an ancient wine press. Around the walls were stone niches holding bottles that were worth more than my life. And there, in the center of the rack marked 1920 to 1930, was the empty slot. The dust in the niche was disturbed, a rectangular void where the 1924 had sat. I approached it like a crime scene. I shined my light on the stone shelf. There were drag marks in the dust, Mateo's clumsy theft. But I looked closer. On the limestone floor, directly beneath the empty slot, there was a faint, dark smear. I knelt down. I touched it with a gloved finger. It wasn't just dust, it was soot. Carbon. Mateo said he used a lighter to melt the wax. But Mateo had done that in his car or at home. Why was there soot here? Unless someone else had applied heat here. I crouched lower, sweeping the light across the cobblestones. The floor was uneven, full of cracks and crevices. Something glinted. I pulled out a pair of tweezers. Wedged deep between two stones was a tiny, jagged object. I plucked it out and held it up to the light. It was a shard of black sealing wax, but embedded in the wax was a tiny silver sliver. I brought it closer to the lens. It was the tip of a hypodermic needle. It must have snapped off. The wax on a 100-year-old bottle becomes hard as stone. If the killer tried to force a needle through it without heating it enough, snap. So they had to melt it. They used a lighter here in the dark to soften the wax enough to extract the broken tip and slide a fresh needle in. This confirmed the method. It confirmed the location. But who? Lucas had the needles. He had the motive. I stood up, scanning the room. The killer had stood right here. They had been patient. They had worked with steady hands. My beam swept over the tasting table in the corner. It was a beautiful piece of oak, used for private tastings. I walked over. The trash bin under the table was empty. The cleaning staff was efficient. I lay on my back on the cold floor and shined the light on the underside of the table. There, stuck to the rough wood with blobs of black wax, were 3 corks. I felt a chill go down my spine. I pried one loose. It was a new cork, standard issue synthetic, but it had been dipped in black wax. I examined the top, a tiny microscopic puncture mark. Practice. Someone had stood here, hidden in the sanctuary, practicing the injection. testing how much pressure the wax could take before cracking, testing the angle, testing the heat. Stick, inject, hide. This wasn't a crime of passion. I bagged the cork and the needle tip. I stood up, brushing the dust from my clothes. The silence of the cellar pressed against my ears. I closed my eyes, trying to visualize the scene. The killer enters. The code or a key? Lucas has both. Sophia has both. Mateo has both. The killer takes the bottle. They see the damage Mateo caused. They smile. It's an opportunity. They try the needle. It breaks. Panic? No. Improvisation. They use a lighter. They inject the cyanide. They smooth the wax. They put the bottle back. And then they leave. I took a deep breath, and then I smelled it. It was faint, masked by the heavy scent of oak and wine, but it was there. Jasmine. Not the flower, the perfume. It was a scent I knew intimately. It was the scent of my childhood. It was the scent that lingered in our kitchen on Sunday mornings. It was my mother's perfume. I froze. Why would the cellar smell of jasmine? Isabella hadn't set foot in the winery in 30 years. She hated this place. She blamed it for taking her husband. Unless... I remembered the dinner, the yellow dress, the way she looked at Alvaro. I am light enough tonight. My phone buzzed in my pocket, shattering the silence. I checked the screen. Unknown number. I answered, my voice low. Thorne. You are digging in the dirt, Elias, a voice whispered. It was distorted, digital, metallic. Be careful. You might find bones you don't want to know. Who is this? I demanded. Stop looking at the children, the voice hissed. Look at the ledger. Click. The line went dead. I stood in the darkness of the sanctuary. Look at the ledger. Alvaro had said the same thing at dinner. The ledger is balanced. I looked at the empty slot where the 1924 had been. I realized I might be looking at the wrong crime. Is it possible that the murder of Alvaro Santos wasn't about the inheritance? There might be a chance that the voice is right. It was about the past. Chapter 6. The Ledger. The digital voice on the phone had told me to look at the ledger. It was suspicious, but I couldn't leave any stone unturned. I stood in the darkness of the vineyard, the smell of jasmine still ghosting in my nose, and looked up at the main house. Lucas was in the study, shredding modern documents, bank loans, trade deals, the desperate scrambling of a son trying to bury his failures. But the voice hadn't meant Lucas's iPad or the crypto accounts. It meant paper. Old paper. Every great winery has an archive, a place where they keep the history of the soil, rainfall logs, harvest yields, bottling dates. In a place like the Ribera del Duero, where tradition was religion, nothing was ever thrown away. The past wasn't trash, it was provenance. I bypassed the main house, keeping to the shadows of the cypress trees. I headed for the old administrative building, a small stone structure near the crushing pads that predated the modern renovation. It looked like a mausoleum. The door was secured with a heavy, rusted padlock. It was an embarrassment of security, a lock designed to keep out honest people. I pulled a tension wrench from my kit. Click, twist, pop. The lock fell open. I stepped inside. The air was dry, suffocating, and smelled of decaying paper and dead flies. Moonlight filtered through the high, barred windows, illuminating rows of metal filing cabinets and shelves stacked with leather-bound books. I clicked on my penlight. The beam cut through the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. I wasn't looking for 2026. I was looking for the rot. I walked to the shelves marked with dates. 1980, 1985, 1990. I pulled down the heavy ledger marked 1995 to 2000. This was the era I remembered as a teenager. The era when Finca Santos suddenly transformed from a struggling local winery into a global powerhouse. The era when the new cellars were dug and the export deals were signed. I opened it on a dusty drafting table. The handwriting was Alvaro's, elegant, sharp, assertive. The ink was black, fading to gray. I traced the columns back to 1996. The numbers were bleeding red. January 1996, frost damage, 30% crop loss. June 1996, Expansion loan interest rate hiked to 14%. Banco Santander threatening foreclosure on the East Bloc. December 1996. Capital reserves critical. Payroll missed. Alvaro had been ambitious. He had borrowed heavily to plant new vines and build the modern fermentation hall, betting everything on a bumper crop that never came. By early 1997, the estate was technically insolvent. The kingdom was a house of cards waiting for a breeze. Then I reached November 1997. I paused, my finger hovering over the page. I remembered that month. It was the month it rained for 3 weeks straight, turning the valley into a mudslide. And it was the month the bells of San Esteban rang for a funeral. November 12th, 1997. Doña Elena Santos, deceased. Childbirth. Elena, Lucas, Sofia, and Mateo's mother. I closed my eyes, summoning a memory. I saw her in the kitchen of the big house, pale and thin, clutching a handkerchief. She always looked tired, her skin translucent. She used to give me anise cookies when I came over to play. "Don't run, Elias," she would whisper, breathless. "My heart can't take the noise." We were told she had a congenital heart defect. We were told the stress of the business finally broke her and left her weak and unable to survive childbirth. I looked at the ledger entry for November 19th, 1997, exactly 1 week after her death. Entry, Allianz Global, Life Assurance Payout Number 883-X, Key Person Policy. Subject, Elena Santos. Role, Director of Operations and Chief Logistics Officer. Amount, 300 million pesetas. Approx. 1.8 million euro today. I stared at the number. The dust motes dancing in my flashlight beam seemed to freeze. 300 million pesetas. That wasn't a standard life insurance policy for a housewife. That was a corporate policy for a CEO, a titan of industry. And the title? Director of Operations? Elena Santos didn't run operations. She baked bread. She volunteered at the church. She was terrified of the machinery. Alvaro ran everything. He was the micromanager, the tyrant. He had given her a puffed-up corporate title on paper. Why? To justify a key person insurance policy. Corporations take out these policies on essential executives whose death would financially cripple the company. If the CFO dies, the insurance pays out millions to keep the business afloat. Alvaro had turned his wife into a corporate asset. He had inflated her value, paid the exorbitant premiums while the winery was bleeding cash. And then he waited. Or maybe he didn't wait. I moved to the filing cabinet labeled Insurance/Legal 1997. I thumbed through the yellowed papers until I found the policy copy. Policy origination date, January 1997. He took out the policy at the height of the financial crisis, 10 months before she died. Father Diego had said Elena's heart was weak, that the stress killed her. But looking at these numbers, I saw a different story. Alvaro knew she was sick. He knew her heart couldn't take the strain. And instead of shielding her, instead of letting her rest, he loaded her with the director title. He pushed the business forward. He created the stress that he knew would kill her. Then he gave her the baby that did. He harvested her, just like he harvested the Tempranillo grapes. He squeezed her until she broke, and then he drank the profits. The 300 million pesetas didn't just pay the debts, it built the empire. The new seller, the export deals, the legacy. It was all paid for with Elena's stopped heart. I felt a wave of nausea. This was the man who had sat at the riverbank tonight, talking about perfection and sacrifice. He hadn't sacrificed anything. He had sacrificed everyone else. I closed the folder, my hand shaking slightly. If he was capable of this, of monetizing his own wife's death to save his business, what else was he capable of? Elena died in 1997. That cleared the expansion debts. But the winery had been in trouble before that, in the early 90s. I remembered the arguments in my own kitchen. I remembered my father complaining about Alvaro's reckless spending, about the first attempt to modernize the irrigation. I looked at the shelf again. There was another ledger, 1990 to 1995. A cold knot formed in my stomach, tighter and heavier than the one I felt when I faced down cartels. My father, Gabriel, died in July 1994. He was a mechanic, a simple man who fixed tractors, oiled the presses, and came home with grease under his fingernails. He wasn't family, he wasn't a director, he wasn't a partner. But he was Alvaro's best friend, and he died in a tragic accident right when the winery was facing its first bankruptcy. I reached for the older ledger. My hand hovered over the spine. I didn't want to open it. I wanted to walk away. I wanted to go back to being the magician, the man who could make things disappear. But the wolf doesn't look away. The wolf tracks the blood to the source. I pulled the book down. Dust coated my fingers. I opened it to July 1994. The entry was written in the same elegant, assertive hand. July 20th, 1994. Zurich Insurance Group. Indemnity claim number 4492B. Accidental death and liability. Subject, Gabriel Thorne. Role, Chief Engineering Partner. Amount, 250 million pesetas. I read it again. Chief Engineering Partner. My father wasn't a partner. He was an employee. He didn't own shares. He didn't sit in board meetings. But according to this book, he was worth 250 million pesetas. I looked at the notes in the margin. July 21st, 1994. Mortgage on West Vineyard paid in full. July 22nd, 1994. Santander operating loan cleared. August 1st, 1994. Isabella Thorne, support trust established. I stepped back, feeling the air leave my lungs. I knocked over a stack of papers, but I didn't hear them hit the floor. The only sound in the room was the rushing of my own blood. It was a blueprint. Alvaro hadn't just built an empire, he had built a slaughterhouse. In 1994, the winery was failing, so he took out a policy on his best friend, my father, inflated his title to justify the coverage, and then the tractor brakes failed. The payouts saved the land. In 1997, the expansion was failing, so he took out a policy on his wife, Elena. She died in childbirth. The payout built the new cellar. He had literally paved the road to Finca Santos with the bodies of the people who loved him. I thought of the photo in Lucas's study. The four of them. Young, smiling. The quartet. Alvaro had looked at them and seen assets. He had looked at his wife and seen a line of credit. He had looked at his best friend and seen a liquidity event. And my mother? I looked at the entry again. August 1st, 1994. Isabella Thorne. Support trust established. Chapter 7. The Root of the Vine. 10 days after the payout. I stared at the entry in the ledger. The ink faded, but the truth screaming off the page. August 1st, 1994. Isabella Thorne. Support trust established. Was it hush money or was it guilt money? I remembered how we lived after my father died. The memory washed over me, cold and sharp. I was 7 years old. The funeral had been a blur of black umbrellas and rain, but the years that followed were vivid. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor. While other families in the village struggled when the frost killed the buds or the market price of Tempranillo crashed, we were stable. The mortgage on the farmhouse was mysteriously paid off. I went to a private technical college in Madrid, not the local trade school. There was always food on the table, good meat, fresh bread. My mother had told me it was because she worked hard, because she sold the olives from the grove behind the house, because she took in sewing. But olives don't pay off mortgages in a week, and sewing doesn't pay for engineering tuition. She took the money. My mother, the woman who walked to church every Sunday, the woman who wore black for 30 years. She took the money from the man who profited from her husband's death. Why? Because the past is heavy, Elias. I grabbed the ledger. I shoved it into my bag, feeling the weight of it against my hip. I wasn't a detective anymore. I wasn't an operative. I was a son who had just realized his entire life, my education, my escape, my freedom, was funded by my father's murder. I left the archives, leaving the door swinging open in the night wind, creaking like a broken bone. I needed to talk to the only person who had been there for all the funerals, the man who had buried Gabriel in the mud, buried Elena in the rain, and baptized me in the font. I drove to the church of San Esteban. The village was asleep, the streets empty except for a stray cat hunting in the shadows of the bakery. The church loomed at the end of the plaza, a fortress of stone that had stood since the 12th century. It was older than the vineyards, older than the money, and certainly older than the sins of the Santos family. I parked the car and ran to the rectory. I banged on the heavy wooden doors. "Father Diego!" I shouted, the sound echoing in the empty square. "Open the door!" I didn't wait for an answer. I pulled my tension wrench from my pocket. It was a simple medieval ward mechanism, iron and rust. It yielded easily to modern steel. Click. I pushed inside. Father Diego was in the sacristy, wearing his white nightshirt, holding a beeswax candle. He was 80 years old, frail as a dried tobacco leaf, his skin like parchment. He shielded his eyes from the beam of my flashlight. He looked terrified. "Elias," he gasped, "what are you doing? It is 3 a.m. "I know," I said, walking toward him. The smell of incense and old stone filled my nose. I tossed the heavy ledger onto the polished wood of the pew. It landed with a sound like a gunshot. "We need to talk about 1994, I said. Father Diego looked at the book. He didn't touch it. He crossed himself, his hand trembling. "I told you, Elias. The seal of the confessional." "This isn't a confession," I yelled, my voice echoing off the vaulted stone arches. "This is evidence. He insured them, Father. He turned my father and his wife into lottery tickets. Gabriel in 94, Elena in 97. Did you know?" Father Diego sank onto the bench, the candle flickering in his shaking hand, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. "I suspected," he whispered. "We all suspected. Alvaro. He was a man possessed by the land. He believed the winery was a god that required feeding. He murdered my father," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "The tractor brakes didn't just fail. He cut them, or he paid someone to cut them." "Gabriel was the best mechanic in the valley," the priest whispered, staring at the floor tiles. "He checked those lines every morning. He loved that machine. For them to fail, it was impossible. He was sacrificed," I said, "and then Alvaro paid my mother. I saw the entry. Support trust." He bought her silence. Father Diego looked up. His eyes were watery, filled with a deep, ancient pity that made my stomach turn. "He didn't buy her silence, Elias. You don't understand." "What don't I understand?" I demanded, pacing in front of the altar. "My mother was a widow with a 7-year-old son. She was poor. He waved a check in her face and she looked the other way while he buried her husband." "No," Father Diego said firmly, finding a shred of strength. "Isabella would never take blood money, not for greed." "Then why?" Father Diego sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the crypt. "Because she loved him." I froze. "She loved my father." "I know she did. I saw them together." "She loved Gabriel, yes," Father Diego said quietly. "Gabriel was good. He was safe. He was the earth, solid, dependable. But Alvaro was the fire." He gestured to the stained glass window, dark now in the night. "Before she married your father, Elias, she and Alvaro, they were inseparable. It was the great romance of the valley. But she was a migrant worker from the south, and he was the heir to the estate. His father forbade the match. He threatened to disown him." The priest looked at the statue of the Virgin Mary in the alcove. "So Alvaro married a wealthy woman from Madrid, Elena, to secure the capital for the business. And Isabella married the mechanic because he was kind and he loved her. But the fire never went out. It just burned underground." I felt sick. The romantic tragedy of the valley, rewritten as a horror story. They were having an affair. "For years," Father Diego admitted. "Gabriel knew. Elena knew. It was the open secret of the valley. A tragedy of 4 people trapped in a web of duty. They tried to be friends. They tried to have picnics by the river, to pretend everything was normal. But the jealousy, it ate Alvaro alive. He had the money, he had the land, but he didn't have her." I leaned against a stone pillar, my head spinning. "So when Gabriel died," I whispered. "Isabella was devastated," Father Diego said. "She knew immediately. When the tractor rolled, she knew it wasn't an accident. She went to Alvaro. She screamed at him. She threatened to burn the winery to the ground. But she didn't, I said. She took the trust fund. She was trapped, Diego said. Alvaro saved the winery with the insurance money, yes, but he also swore an oath to her. What oath? That he did it for her, Father Diego said. He told her that Gabriel's death would ensure that you, Gabriel's son, would never starve, that the valley would survive. He promised her that he would carry the burden of the sin, so she wouldn't have to. He manipulated her, I said, disgusted. He killed her husband and then told her it was an act of love. Alvaro was a master of narratives, Father Diego agreed. He convinced himself he was the tragic hero, doing the terrible thing for the greater good. And tonight? I asked. Why tonight? Why did he die? Father Diego looked at the ledger lying on the pew. Because a man like Alvaro cannot live with that much debt forever, he said. Perhaps the ledger finally had to be balanced. I grabbed the book. I left the church without saying goodbye. The night air felt suffocating now, thick with the smell of jasmine and rot. I drove back toward the farmhouse. The pieces were rearranging themselves into a picture I didn't want to see. Alvaro hadn't just killed my father for money. He had done it to save the future. And he had used his bond with my mother, that twisted underground love, to keep her quiet. He had turned her into an accomplice to the murder of the man who raised me. But silence has a shelf life, and tonight the shelf had collapsed. I looked at the farmhouse in the distance. The kitchen light was still on, a yellow beacon in the dark. My mother was waiting. I pulled into the gravel driveway. I cut the engine. I wasn't sure if I was going home to a victim or a monster. I walked up the porch steps. The wood creaked under my boots. I pushed open the door. My mother wasn't in the kitchen, but the table was set. There was a bottle of wine on the table. Not the 1924, just a simple table red, the cork pulled, and next to it, a small velvet box. I walked over. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not with fear of a killer, but fear of the truth. I opened the box. Inside was a silver brooch, a swallow in flight. I recognized it. It belonged to my grandmother. My mother wore it every Sunday, but under the brooch was a folded piece of paper. The paper was yellowed, brittle with age. I unfolded it. The handwriting was Alvaro's, dated August 1st, 1994. My dearest Isabella, I cannot bring Gabriel back. I cannot undo the sin, and I know you will never forgive me for the price of this salvation. But the vines will survive. Your son will grow strong. I will build a kingdom for him, and when the work is done, when the children are safe and the debts are cleared, I will give you the only thing I have left to offer, my life. When you are ready to collect, ask for the 1924. I will know it is time. Yours in eternity, A. I dropped the note. The silence of the farmhouse crashed down around me. It wasn't a murder. It was a contract, a suicide pact signed 30 years ago. I heard a floorboard creak above me. She was upstairs. I grabbed the note. I grabbed the ledger, and I walked toward the stairs. I wasn't Agent Thorne anymore. I was just a son, climbing the stairs to ask his mother why she had waited 30 years to kill the man she loved. Chapter 8. The Promise. The stairs of the farmhouse groaned under my weight. Each creak sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house, a wooden protest against the secrets I was carrying up them. I held the yellowed note in my left hand and the heavy ledger in my right. My ceramic knife was still tucked in my sleeve, a useless artifact of a life where enemies were strangers, not family. I reached the landing. The door to my mother's bedroom was ajar. A slice of yellow light spilled out onto the floorboards. I pushed it open. Isabella was sitting in the velvet armchair by the open window, looking out at the dark vineyards and the distant, flashing lights of the police cars still parked at the riverbank. She wasn't packing a bag. She wasn't crying. She was holding a glass of wine, the cheap table red from the kitchen, and rocking gently. She was still wearing the yellow linen dress, the fabric now wrinkled from the night's humidity. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. "You found the box," she said, without turning around. Her voice was steady, light as a feather. "I found the note," I said, walking into the room. I placed the ledger on her vanity table. It looked ugly and heavy next to her perfume bottles and the silver hairbrush Gabriel had given her for their first anniversary. "And I found the accounting, Mama. Gabriel, Elena, the insurance payouts." She stopped rocking. She took a slow sip of wine. "Alvaro was a brilliant man," she whispered, "but he always believed that everything had a price, even souls. He thought if he paid enough, the sin would disappear." I walked around the chair so I could see her face. She looked tired now, the radiant energy of the dinner gone, replaced by a hollow, brittle peace. "He killed Papa," I said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation that had been waiting 30 years to be spoken. Isabella closed her eyes. A spasm of pain crossed her face, sharp and fresh. "Yes," she admitted, "he did." "And you knew?" "Not at first," she said, opening her eyes. They were dark, swimming with memory. "When the tractor flipped, I thought it was an accident. We all did. Gabriel was careful, but the mud, the rain." She took a breath, her fingers tightening on the glass. "But a month later, Alvaro came to me. He brought me the check for the trust fund. He was shaking. He was crying. He told me he had saved the valley. He told me he had saved us." "By cutting the brakes?" "He loosened the hydraulic line," she corrected softly, as if the technical detail mattered. "He said he didn't think Gabriel would die. He thought he would just crash, get hurt, collect the disability insurance. But the riverbank collapsed. The earth took him." "So it was manslaughter," I said. "It was murder, Elias," she said firmly, "because he knew the risk, and he took it because he loved the vines more than he loved his best friend." "And you let him live," I accused, my voice rising. "You took his money. You lived next door to him for 30 years. You watched him build his empire on Papa's bones." Isabella stood up. She was small, but in that moment she looked towering. "I didn't take his money," she hissed. "I took his life." She walked to the window, staring at the silhouette of the Villa Santos. "I wanted to go to the police," she said, her voice trembling with a rage I had never seen before. "I wanted to scream it to the world. But you were 7 years old, Elias. We had nothing. If I sent Alvaro to prison, the winery would close. The bank would take our house. We would be on the street. And Gabriel, his death would have been for nothing." She turned back to me. "So I made a deal with the devil. I told Alvaro I would keep his secret. I would let him build his empire, but in exchange, he belonged to me." "The note," I said, holding up the yellowed paper. "He wrote it the day I confronted him," she said. "He promised that once the debts were cleared, once the children, Lucas, Sophia, Mateo, and you, were grown and safe, he would pay the final price." "Suicide," I said. "Justice," she corrected. "An eye for an eye, a life for a life." "And Elena?" I asked. "Did he pay for her too?" Isabella looked away. Elena was the tragedy we didn't expect. Alvaro pushed her. He needed the second payout to finish the cellar. He pressured her to have another child, Mateo, when he knew her heart was weak. He gambled with her life just like he gambled with Gabriel's. "So he killed 2 people, I said, "and tonight was the execution." "The children are settled," she said. "The estate is secure, and She touched the silver swallow brooch I had placed on the table. "I am tired of waiting, Elias. I am tired of hating the man I love." I stared at her. "You love him?" "I have loved him since I was 16, she whispered, "and I have hated him since I was 37. It is a terrible thing to love your husband's killer. It rots you from the inside. It makes you a stranger to yourself." She looked at the glass in her hand. "Tonight at the river, I finally set us both free." "You poisoned him," I said. "No," she said. "I didn't lift a finger. Alvaro did it all." She sat back down, smoothing the yellow linen over her knees. "He prepared the bottle," she explained. "He told me once, years ago. He injected the cork with cyanide. He sealed it with wax. He placed it in the sanctuary in the slot for 1924. It was his sword of Damocles. It sat there, waiting for me to give the order. The signal, I realized. Wait for the 1924. Yes, she said. For years he would ask me with his eyes, "Is it time, Isabella?" And I would look at you, growing up, going to school, and I would say, "Not yet," because I needed his money to keep you safe. I needed his guilt to pay for your freedom. She smiled sadly. But you are safe now, Elias. You are a strong man. You don't need his money, and I don't need his guilt. So when he invited us to dinner, he knew, she said. He called me this morning. He said, "I am tired, Isabella. The ledger is heavy." He asked if he could open the bottle. And you said yes. I wore yellow, she said, touching the fabric, because it was the color I wore the day I met him. The day the four of us, me, Gabriel, Elena, Alvaro, swam in the river for the first time. I wanted him to see the girl he loved, not the widow he made. She looked at me, pleading for understanding. At the table, when he offered me the wine, that was the question. If I drank, he would not. We would continue the charade. But I refused. I am light enough tonight. That was the sentence. He drank it willingly, I said, feeling the horror of the ritual. He wanted to go. It wasn't murder, Elias, she said. It was mercy. I stood there, the weight of the confession crushing me. It was a perfect, tragic logic. A 30-year suicide pact executed in plain sight. But there was a flaw. A massive, catastrophic flaw that neither of them had anticipated in their romantic fatalism. "Mama," I said, my voice cold, "Alvaro is dead. He got his mercy. But do you know where Sophia is?" Isabella blinked, confused. "Sophia? She is home, I assume, grieving." "She's in a cell," I said brutally, "in San Esteban." Isabella dropped her glass. It shattered on the floor, red wine splashing onto the hem of her yellow dress like fresh blood. "What?" "The police arrested her," I said, "because Alvaro didn't write a suicide note. He didn't leave a confession. He just died of poison after Sophia poured the glass." "No," Isabella whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. "No, that wasn't the plan. He said it would look like a heart attack. He said cyanide stops the heart quickly. He said they wouldn't look closely at an old man dying after dinner. They looked closely, Mama. They found the poison in the glass. And since the bottle tested clean, because the poison was on the cork, they think Sophia slipped it in." I stepped closer to her. "Your justice is about to send an innocent woman to prison for life. Sophia, the girl you helped raise when Elena died, the girl who looks just like him." Isabella began to shake. The calm facade shattered completely. She wasn't the avenging angel anymore. She was a horrified old woman. "I didn't know," she sobbed. "I swear, Elias, we didn't think. We just wanted it to end." "Well, it's not ending," I said. "It's just beginning. Lucas is being investigated. Sophia is charged with murder. And if I give this note to the police, you go to jail for conspiracy to commit murder and assisted suicide." Isabella looked at the note on the table. Then she looked at me. "Then destroy it," she said instantly. "Burn it, Elias. Save yourself. Save the family name." "And let Sophia rot?" I asked. "Is that the price? Gabriel died for the land. Elena died for the cellar. Does Sophia die for your peace?" I can confess," she stammered, standing up. "I can tell Morales about the pact." "If you confess, the estate is seized," I said. "The insurance fraud from 1994 comes out. The winery is liquidated to pay back Zurich and Allianz. Lucas and Sophia lose everything. The workers lose their jobs. The valley dies. And you go to prison until you die." I paced the room. It was a mess. A beautiful, tragic mess. "We can't use the truth," I said. "The truth destroys everyone." "Then what do we do?" she wept. I looked at the shattered wine glass. I looked at the ledger. I thought about the cork in my pocket, the needle tip I had found in the cellar, the magician's choice. "We have to finish the trick," I said. "Alvaro wanted to die. He arranged his own death. We just have to prove he did it alone." "How?" "We need to prove suicide," I said, "but a lonely suicide, not a pact." I looked at my mother. "Think, Mama, when he called you this morning, Did he sound like he was in the house? Or was there an echo? Isabella frowned, wiping her tears. There was a hum, a fan. The ventilation in the winery, I said. And he smelled, she paused. When he took my hand at dinner, he smelled of chemicals, under his cologne. Bitter almonds, I guessed. No, she said. Wax. Burnt wax. I grabbed her shoulders. Listen to me. I need you to stay here. Do not leave this house. Do not speak to Morales. I'm going to find the proof that Alvaro did this to himself. Elias, she whispered, grabbing my sleeve, if you prove it was suicide, will they look for the ledger? Will they look for Gabriel? That stays buried, I said. Alvaro takes those secrets to hell with him. I turned to the door. But Sophia walks free, I said. That's the new deal. I ran down the stairs, leaving my mother standing in the ruins of her revenge. She had gotten her wish. The debt was paid, but the interest was higher than she ever imagined. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I had to frame a dead man for the crime he actually committed, but for a reason he never intended. Chapter 9. The Prestige. The sun was just beginning to bruise the horizon, turning the sky a deep, violent purple, when I pulled up to the main gates of Finca Santos. I had changed. I wasn't wearing my dusty work clothes anymore. I had gone back to my mother's house and put on the only suit I had with me, a black funeral suit I kept for emergencies. I needed the armor. I needed to look like the magician, the man who controlled the room, not the mechanic's son who picked locks. I had called Inspector Morales. I had called Lucas. I had told them to meet me in the cellar. I walked down the stone steps into the fermentation hall. The air was cool, smelling of yeast and secrets. The stainless steel tanks hummed, oblivious to the fact that their master was dead. They were waiting for me in the sanctuary. The room felt claustrophobic. Inspector Morales looked exhausted, nursing a coffee in a styrofoam cup that looked incongruously cheap against the millions of dollars of vintage wine surrounding him. Lucas was pacing, his eyes bloodshot, his expensive suit now a wrinkled mess. Mateo was sitting on a barrel, looking like he was trying to make himself invisible. "This better be good, Elias," Morales rumbled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I'm supposed to be filing formal charges against Sophia in an hour. The district attorney is already pressuring me." "You won't be filing charges," I said, my voice steady, "because Sophia didn't kill him." "We know the theory," Lucas snapped, chewing on a fingernail. "The magic trick, the poison in the glass. We've been over this. She had the opportunity." "It wasn't in the glass," I said, "and it wasn't a murder." I walked to the center of the room, standing under the single hanging light bulb. I felt like I was back on stage in Macau, or Paris, or Bangkok. The audience was hostile. The stakes were life and death. And the trick had to be perfect. "It was a performance," I said. "The final performance of Alvaro Santos." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small plastic evidence bag I had taken from my own kit. Inside was the tiny, jagged object I had found earlier. "I found this on the floor," I said, holding it up to the light. "Right here, directly under the shelf where the 1924 was stored." Morales squinted at it. "What is it?" "It's a shard of black sealing wax," I said, with the tip of a hypodermic needle embedded in it. I turned to Lucas. "Lucas, you have a medical kit in your bathroom for your wasp allergy. When I was there last night, I checked it. 2 needles were missing." Lucas went pale. He backed away, hitting a wine rack. I didn't... Elias, you can't pin this on me." "You didn't do it," I interrupted calmly, "but someone who had access to your house did. Someone who had keys to every door in this estate." I turned back to Morales. "The killer came down here. They took the 1924 bottle. They tried to inject liquid cyanide through the wax seal into the cork. But the wax was old and hard. The first needle broke." I pointed to the spot on the floor. "So they realized they had to soften the wax. They used a lighter. They melted it, slid the second needle in, injected the poison into the sponge of the cork, and let it reharden." "This is all theory, Elias," Morales said, crossing his arms. "Even if that's true, it just proves premeditation. It doesn't prove it wasn't Sophia. She has keys, too. She knows the cellar better than anyone. Sophia respects the wine, I said. She's a vintner. She wouldn't use a lighter on a vintage cork. She knows the heat would damage the integrity of the wine, and she wouldn't be clumsy enough to snap a needle. Then who? Morales demanded, his patience snapping. Who has the arrogance to ruin a priceless bottle just to kill an old man? The only person who didn't care about the wine anymore, I said, because he wasn't planning on drinking it. He was planning on using it as a prop. I walked over to the tasting table in the corner. I had set this stage an hour ago before I called them. Come here, Rafa. Morales walked over, annoyed. Look under the table, I commanded. Morales frowned, bent down, and shined his flashlight. He saw the 3 corks stuck to the underside of the wood with blobs of black wax. What the hell? Practice, I said. The killer needed to know how much pressure the wax could take. They stood here, probably late at night, testing the injection method. Stick, inject, hide. They hid the evidence where the cleaners wouldn't look. I pulled out my ceramic knife. I carefully pried the corks loose, letting them fall into Morales's hand. These are new corks, I said, dipped in sealing wax. Look at the puncture marks. Morales examined them. Okay, someone practiced. So what? Fingerprints, I said softly. The room went silent. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to get louder. The killer stuck these corks to the underside of the table, I explained. To do that, you have to press hard against the soft, warm wax. It holds an impression like cement. I pointed to the flat, sticky side of the wax that had been pressed against the table. There is a thumbprint embedded in that wax, Rafa. A perfect, preserved ridge detail. I looked at Lucas and Mateo. If you run that print, it won't match Sophia. It won't match Lucas. And it won't match Mateo. Who will it match? Morales asked, his eyes narrowing. Run it against the victim, I said. Lucas gasped. Papa. Alvaro Santos committed suicide, I stated, letting the words hang in the cold air. That's impossible, Mateo whispered. Why? He was the king. He was going to decide the heir. He was building the resort. He was dying, I lied. It was the pivot, the necessary fiction to protect my mother's secret pact. I spoke to his doctor in Madrid, I said, inventing a source Morales would take days to verify, and by then the case would be closed. He had a diagnosis, pancreatic cancer, terminal, painful. He hid it from you all. He didn't want to wither away in a hospital bed. He didn't want you to see him weak. I looked at Lucas. He didn't sign the will, Lucas, because he wanted you to fight for it. He wanted to see who had the strength to survive the chaos. It was his final test. He wanted to go out at the river, surrounded by his family, drinking the best wine in the world. I turned to Morales. He framed Sophia, his own daughter, Morales asked, skeptical. No, I said. He expected you to figure it out. He expected the police to find the needle. He expected you to see a clean bottle and a poisoned cork and rule it a suicide. He didn't account for sloppy police work. I threw a jab at Morales's pride. It was a gamble, but I needed to provoke him. He thought you were a better detective, Rafa, I said. He thought you'd see the mechanics. Instead, you saw the easy answer and arrested the girl. You ruined his final bow. Morales's face turned red. He looked at the evidence in his hand. The narrative fit. The locked room, the lack of poison in the bottle, the theatricality of it. It was exactly the kind of grandiose, arrogant thing Alvaro Santos would do. If that print matches, Morales muttered. It will, I said. I knew it would. Because an hour ago I had taken a wine glass from the dishwasher in the main house, a glass Alvaro had used at lunch, and I had carefully pressed the latent print from it onto the warm wax of the corks I planted. It was a forgery worthy of the best intelligence operatives in the world. Lucas slumped against a barrel, sliding down until he hit the floor. He put his head in his hands and began to weep. Not out of grief, but out of relief. The suspicion was gone. The bank loan was his problem now, but prison wasn't. Mateo just stared at the empty slot in the wine rack. He did it to himself, Mateo whispered. The crazy old bastard, he wanted to traumatize us one last time. An hour later, I stood outside the police station in San Esteban. The sun was fully up now, baking the streets. The heavy metal door opened with a buzz. Sophia walked out. She looked terrible. Her overalls were wrinkled, her face streaked with dirt and tears. But her hands were free. She saw Lucas and Mateo waiting by the family SUV. She ignored them. She walked straight to me. She didn't say a word. She threw her arms around my neck and buried her face in my shoulder. She smelled of jail soap, fear, and the lingering scent of grapes. "You got me out," she sobbed into my jacket. "I told you," I whispered, holding her tight. "I'm not a ghost." She pulled back, looking at my face. Her dark eyes were searching mine, looking for the truth. Rafa said, "He said Papa did it, that he was sick." "He chose his exit, Sophia," I said, repeating the lie. "He wanted to go out as the king." She wiped her eyes, looking toward the hills where the winery stood. "He was a selfish, arrogant son of a bitch," she said, her voice trembling. "He almost destroyed us all to make a point, just like he destroyed Mama." "Yes," I agreed. "He did." Lucas walked over, looking sheepish. "Sophia, Don't," she snapped, holding up a hand. "You were ready to let me rot, Lucas. I won't forget that." "I was scared," Lucas pleaded. "We were all scared," she said, "but only one of us stood by me." She looked at me. There was a moment of silence between us, a shared understanding of the madness of our parents. The quartet had left us a legacy of trauma, and we were the ones cleaning it up. "Thank you, Elias." "Go home," I said. "Take a shower. Drink some cheap wine. Forget about the 1924. "Will you come?" she asked. "Stay at the main house tonight? We need someone who isn't family. Someone sane." I looked at her. I looked at the brothers. They were safe. The estate was safe. The debt was paid. But I couldn't stay. "I have to check on my mother," I said, feeling the weight of the secret ledger in my bag and the knowledge of what was waiting for me at the farmhouse. She took it hard. Sophia nodded understandingly. "Isabella, she loved him, didn't she? In her own way. They were the last two left." "Yeah," I said. "She did." I watched them drive away. The three heirs to a kingdom built on blood and insurance fraud. They would fight. They would bicker. But they would survive. Alvaro had ensured that. I walked to my mother's rusted Fiat. The magician's choice was complete. The audience was satisfied. I had proven the suicide. I had saved Sophia. But I still had the cork in my pocket. The real cork from the murder weapon, the one Mateo had chipped and Alvaro had poisoned. And I had the needle I had found in the cellar. I hadn't given Morales the needle I found. I gave him a similar one from my own kit. I had to frame a dead man for the crime he actually committed, because the truth, the pact, the murder of my father, the hush money, wasn't enough. It would have burned the valley down. I drove toward the farmhouse. Now I just had to bury the props. Chapter 10. The Angel's Share. The morning sun hit the vineyards with the force of a hammer. The dew burned off the vines, rising in a ghostly mist that clung to the limestone cliffs. I drove up the gravel track to the farmhouse. My suit jacket was thrown on the passenger seat, my tie undone. I was exhausted. I had spent the night staging a crime scene, manipulating a police inspector, and lying to the woman I used to love. But as I pulled up to the house, I saw a sleek black Mercedes parked next to the rusted gate. Leaning against it was a man I recognized from the periphery of the funeral photos. Alejandro Vargas, Alvaro's personal attorney and the executor of the Santos estate. He was immaculate in a navy suit, checking a gold watch. When he saw me, he straightened up, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. I stopped the car and got out. "Mr. Vargas," I said, "the police released the family." "The family is processing the grief," Vargas said, his voice smooth and dry. "I am here for you, Mr. Thorne." "Me? I'm not in the will." "No," Vargas agreed. "You are not, but I was given a specific instruction by Don Alvaro, a codicil to his duties, to be executed in the event of his sudden death." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a burner phone, the same cheap model that had called me in the cellar at 3 a.m. He held it out to me. "I believe you answered this call last night." I stared at the phone. "It was you," I said. "The digital voice. Look at the ledger." "I made the call," Vargas confirmed, "per my client's strict instructions. He recorded the message himself a month ago. He instructed me that if he were to die, under unnatural circumstances, I was to wait 6 hours and then play that recording to you." "Why?" I demanded. "If he was going to kill himself, why lead me to the evidence of his crimes? Why show me that he murdered my father?" Vargas looked up at the Villa Santos on the hill, his expression tightening with a mix of judgment and resignation. "Because he was a coward, Mr. Thorne." The words hung in the air, sharp and brutal, coming from the man paid to protect Alvaro's reputation. "Don Alvaro was a visionary," Vargas continued, "but he could not bear to look you in the eye and tell you what he did. He couldn't face the judgment of Gabriel's son while he was alive. He wanted the glory of the sacrifice, dying to save the family from bankruptcy, but he also wanted absolution." "Absolution," I scoffed. "He wanted you to know the truth," Vargas said. "He wanted you to know that your inheritance, your education, your escape to America was paid for by your father. He wanted to give you the closure he couldn't give you himself. He wanted you to know he didn't forget Gabriel." "He didn't forget him," I said bitterly. "He just cashed him in." Vargas nodded once. "I have fulfilled my obligation. The ledger, I assume, has been found?" "It has." "Then my work here is done. Good day, Mr. Thorne." He got into his Mercedes and drove away, the dust swirling in his wake. A messenger of the dead, leaving the living to clean up the mess. I watched him go, then turned to the farmhouse. The front door was open. "Mama," I called out, stepping into the cool hallway. There was no answer. I walked into the kitchen. The shattered wine glass was gone. The floor had been swept clean. The table was bare, except for the velvet box and the ledger I had left there. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at my chest. "Mama!" I ran to the back porch. She was there. Isabella was sitting on the wooden swing bench overlooking the valley. She was still wearing the yellow dress. Her hair was brushed and loose, catching the morning breeze. She looked peaceful. She was watching the Finca Santos in the distance, where the police tape was finally being peeled away. "I thought you—" I stopped, leaning against the doorframe, trying to catch my breath. "It's done, Mama. Sophia is out. Morales bought the suicide story. I planted the evidence." She didn't turn around. She just rocked gently back and forth. "You are a good son, Elias," she said softly. "You have your father's hands, but you have Alvaro's mind. You solved his puzzle." I walked over and sat on the railing facing her. "We need to burn the ledger," I said. "And the note. We need to bury 1994. Vargas was here, the lawyer. He told me everything. Alvaro set it up. He wanted me to find out." She smiled, but her eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "Of course he did," she whispered. "He always wanted to be the architect. He couldn't bear the thought of leaving this world without someone knowing how clever he was, how much he suffered for us." She reached down to the floor beside the swing. There was a bottle there, and a single crystal glass. It wasn't the cheap table wine, it was a half bottle, unlabeled, sealed with black wax. "Alvaro gave this to me," she said, picking up the bottle. "A long time ago. He said, 'The 1924 is for the debt. This is for the angel's share.'" "The angel's share?" I asked. "That's the wine that evaporates from the barrel, the part that goes to the heavens." "Or the part that stays behind," she said. She poured the dark liquid into the glass. It smelled of blackberries, leather, and bitter almonds. I froze. "Mama," I said, sliding off the railing, "put the glass down." "He didn't want to go alone, Elias," she said, her voice calm and terrifyingly rational. "That was the pact, not just his death. Ours." "No," I said, reaching for her. "The debt is paid. He was a coward, Mama. He had his lawyer call me. He didn't do this for love. He did it because he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. Don't die for a man who couldn't even tell you the truth to your face." "I know what he was," she said, looking at me. "I know he was a coward. I know he was a murderer. She raised the glass. But he was my life, Elias. I hated him. But without him, without the hate and the love and the secret, I am just a ghost in a yellow dress. Don't! I lunged. I was fast, but I was too slow for a mother who had made up her mind 30 years ago. She drank. I knocked the glass from her hand, shattering it against the porch railing, but it was too late. The red stain was already on her lips. "Mama!" I caught her as she slumped forward. "It's okay," she whispered, her hand finding my face. Her skin was cool. "Gabriel is waiting. Elena is waiting. We are all going to the river." The convulsions hit her a second later. Her body went rigid in my arms. Her eyes rolled back. "Help!" I screamed to the empty vineyards. "Help me!" But there was no one. Just the vines. Just the dust. Just the echo of the river. I held her as she shook. I held her as the foam gathered at the corners of her mouth, staining the yellow dress. I held her until the shaking stopped and she became heavy and still. The silence of the valley rushed back in. I sat there on the porch swing, rocking my dead mother, while the sun climbed higher in the sky. She looked beautiful. She looked like she was sleeping. She finally looked like the woman in the photograph, the girl who stood between the mechanic and the king. I checked for a pulse. There was none. She was with them, the quartet reunited in the dark. I sat there for a long time. Then I stood up. I picked up the ledger. I picked up the suicide note Alvaro had written her. I picked up the velvet box with the swallow brooch. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the gas stove. I threw the note into the flame. It curled and blackened, the promise turning to ash. I opened the ledger to 1994. I tore out the pages detailing my father's death. I tore out the pages about Elena. I fed them to the fire. I wasn't going to let Morales find this. I wasn't going to let the world know she committed suicide. I wasn't going to let them brand her a monster. I carried her body inside. I laid her on the sofa. I folded her hands over her chest. I cleaned the foam from her lips. I placed the silver swallow brooch on her dress. Then I dialed 112. "My name is Elias Thorne," I said, my voice flat and dead. "I need an ambulance at the Thorne farmhouse. My mother, she had a heart attack. She just collapsed. Please, hurry." I hung up. It was the final lie, the final trick. She didn't die of poison. She died of a broken heart. That was the story the valley would tell. That was the legend. 2 days later, the funeral was small. Father Diego performed the rites. Lucas, Sophia, and Mateo stood by the grave, heads bowed. They looked at me with pity. They thought I was grieving a sudden, natural death. "She is at peace," Sophia whispered, squeezing my hand. "She is with your father now." "Yes," I lied. "She is." After the service, I walked back to the farmhouse alone. I packed my bag, one suit, one kit, one ceramic knife. I walked to the edge of the property, where the stone wall separated our land from the Finca Santos. I looked at the vines. They were heavy with grapes, ready for harvest. The roots went deep, drinking from the groundwater, drinking from the bodies of my parents. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the coin, the silver coin with the wolf on one side and the magician's mask on the other. I flipped it high into the air. It caught the Spanish sun, flashing blindingly bright. I caught it. Wolf. It was time to hunt again. I didn't look back at the farmhouse. I didn't look back at the river. I walked down the dusty road, leaving the valley of ghosts behind me, disappearing into the heat of the afternoon.